Wannabe tech gods would like to profile every single person in a society in order to run a simulation of that community.
It's a human right, and it's a human right for good reason, and not only to protect individuals, but also to protect society and to protect democracy. But it's also a duty, and sometimes we forget this, because when you don't protect your privacy, you're also exposing other people to potential harm, and you're eroding democracy. Do I want my policymaker to be asking ChatGPT about how to regulate itself?
We get people to realize what they're giving up when they trade their sovereignty for convenience.
You should remember that life is analog. Everything that matters is analog. Your body, your personal relationships, where you live, what you eat. None of that is digital, and it's never going to be digital. It used to be the case that Europeans were very careful with corporate surveillance and Americans were very careful with government surveillance. But today, the surveillance is really done in collaboration. And pretty much all data that big tech collects could end up in the hands of a government and the other way around. We're acting too much like users and too little like citizens. Technology is not God-given, and we could design it in a different way.
Is democracy at risk?
Disruptors and curious minds, welcome to another episode of Thinking on Paper. I'm Jeremy, this is Mark.
Today we're speaking about privacy, AI ethics with Carissa Veliz, Associate Professor working on AI ethics at Oxford, author of this book, Privacy is Power, an Economist Book of the Year. I just want to start with a quote from her book. Wannabe tech gods would like to profile every single person in a society in order to run a simulation of that community. If you know people's personalities well enough, you can create zombie duplicates of them online and try out different interventions. You can figure out which political message works for them. And once you're confident your message will create the consequences you are after, you let it loose on the world. Through manipulating information, you can sway elections, inspire an insurgency, spark a genocide, turn people against each other, distort their realities until they cannot tell what is true anymore. It's powerful stuff. It's important. Carissa, thank you for thinking on paper with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
It's a pleasure. What is privacy, first and foremost? Because I think a lot of us have forgotten what that is.
It is three things. It's the ability to keep certain kinds of information to yourself or to share it with just a group of people that you decide to share it with. It's also a right in the sense of it's a human right, and it's a human right for good reason, and not only to protect individuals, but also to protect society and to protect democracy. But it's also a duty. And sometimes we forget this, because when you don't protect your privacy, you're also exposing other people to potential harm, and you're eroding democracy.
So that's a big point. We get people to realize what they're giving up when they trade their sovereignty for convenience.
We talk about this and we share previous experiences and we remember the experiences of the people who have come before us. So it's not a coincidence that privacy is part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's because how the Nazis used personal data in the context of the Second World War. It's exactly how they found people and then assassinated them. So it was a very fresh lesson when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written. And we revisit those lessons. We also kind of make more apparent the kinds of information that are being collected about people. So I think a lot of us are aware that very abstract information is collected about us, like what we're purchasing or things like our music taste and maybe our location. But that doesn't really show how vulnerable it makes us, because when you explain to people what location means in the sense of what can be inferred, it means that they know who you live with, where you work, whether you're going to a psychologist, whether you're going to a church, whether you're buying drugs. All kinds of things can be inferred from location. And when you explain to people that it's not that companies are interested only in their music taste. They're interested in inferring things from their music taste, such as political tendencies and sexual orientation. So it's partly about knowing a lot more about how privacy works, how it interacts with democracy, how exactly your data is being collected, what data, how is it being inferred, who is it being shared with. And it's also about thinking more deeply about the pillars of democracy. I think it's easy when you live in a liberal democracy and you've been born in a liberal democracy to take it for granted and to forget what it's like to live under an authoritarian regime and to not understand exactly what makes a democracy and how we might be weakening it. And one of the points I make is, if you think about many of the elements that are essential for a liberal democracy, such as being able to have a lawyer and being able to have a confidential conversation with your lawyer, or being able to be a source for a journalist and for investigative journalism, to be able to do research and to publish, all of that depends on privacy. If you don't have privacy, you can't have a confidential conversation with a lawyer. And if journalists don't have privacy, they can't do their jobs.
I want to read 2 quotes from the books. The first quote is an incredible quote from George Orwell. Political language and tech language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. The second was a stat that you wrote, quote, only a third of Americans under 35 say that it is vital to live in a democracy. And the share who would welcome military government increased from 7% in 1995 to 18% in 2017. That's a terrifying statistic. Is democracy at risk?
Definitely. And there are many signs that that's the case. One of them is that every year the Economist Intelligence Unit makes a study about how democracy is doing around the world. And every year it gets a little bit scarier because we're losing democracy on 2 fronts. The number of countries that are democratic are fewer and fewer, to the point at which now there are more countries that are non-democratic than democratic countries around the world. And the second is that the quality of democracy within democratic countries is weakening. And so you see authoritarian tendencies and very worrisome tendencies within democracies. And George Orwell also made this point that it's easy to become dissatisfied with democracy. Democracy is horrible. It's very inefficient. It's slow. In every country, you can find cases of corruption, cases of injustice, and sometimes really egregious injustice. And George Orwell makes the point that it's not that in democracies those things doesn't happen. They do. But it's how often they happen. And that makes a huge difference. So even if in a liberal democracy, in a very high-functioning liberal democracy, you can find instances of injustice, it pales in comparison to the number and the gravity of injustice in a non-democratic country. And I think people forget this. And when they get disillusioned with democracy, they think that an authoritarian regime might be better. And that is terrifying, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And even if we can find instances of dictatorships that in the beginning might seem benevolent, it's a really dark path to tread on. And especially once you take into account digital technology. I'm partly Spanish, and I've talked to a lot of people in Spain who were alive during the Francoist era and who were part of the resistance. And I've been talking about what methods they used to fight against this very dictatorial regime. And none of the methods that they used would work today, because we have so much surveillance in digital tech with everybody with a phone that it wouldn't work. So we are eroding democracy at the most dangerous of times. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing the weakening of democracies at the same time as the rise of digital tech.
Big government is in bed with big tech, and there isn't increasingly less and less of a division between government and technology.
Yeah, it's true that it's very concerning how big tech is interacting with governments. And when we talk about surveillance, it used to be the case that Europeans were very careful with corporate surveillance and Americans were very careful with government surveillance. But today, the surveillance is really done in collaboration. And pretty much all data that big tech collects could end up in the hands of a government and the other way around. I've made this point in writing before about how, for people who think that only government surveillance is dangerous, in addition to this point about companies and governments sharing data, there's a point about, again, learning from history about how companies can become quite dangerous to political structures. So if you think about India and the colonization of India, I used to very naively think about Great Britain government colonizing India, but that's not what it looked like. It was actually the East India Company who had more soldiers than Great Britain. And so we have had the experience of companies that become so powerful that they become as dictatorial as the worst political regime we've ever seen. And so we should be very careful in making sure that these companies are supporting liberal democracy and not eroding it.
Jeremy?
There's so much to think about with this, because what you have is big tech in government and big tech advocacy within government. Big tech goes in and says, hey guys, this is going to be great. It's going to create these jobs. It's going to make our lives better. We got to do that. We got to do that. And when in reality, as we're seeing with AI, the convergence of a lot of money, a lot of people, and a lot of storytelling to project the future of what it could be. Is that the short circuit point that needs to happen first? The idea of that needs to be decoupled? And if so, how do we decouple that?
Technology is not God-given, and we could design it in a different way. And that wouldn't mean stopping technology. It would just mean designing it better in accordance with liberal democracy. So how do we decouple big tech and government? It's hard. It's very hard. And there isn't an easy way or one way, but it'll depend on citizens being more of citizens. We are acting too much like subjects. We're acting too much like users and too little like citizens. And part of what it means to be a citizen is that it's not only that you vote, but it's also that you take part in your society, that you take responsibility for it, and that you know that you have a role to play in shaping it. Part of what I encourage people to do is to use better products. So why are you using WhatsApp if Signal is out there and it works just as well and it's free and it doesn't collect your data? Because I think people are not aware of how sensitive both companies and governments are to behavioral changes in people. I think most people tend to think that in order for anything to change, everybody has to do the same thing. And that's not true. With just like 5 to 10% of people changing their habits, even if not perfectly, that makes enough of a dent for companies and governments to notice. And privacy is a competitive advantage because we're, as users and as citizens, we're tired of being exploited. So if you have an actual choice between two products that work just as well, but one of them protects your privacy, who wouldn't choose that? So my hope is that we will have some companies that will do a better job at protecting people, either because the CEO is an idealist or because they're smart and they realize it's a competitive advantage, and that will up the standards for everyone else. And that's happened before in history. And so even though we tend to think about government regulating and then companies obeying, sometimes it's the other way around. It's a company that innovates and the government follows by regulating, and then everybody has a new standard.
You speak about this, the loss of the common experience and the power of data, and why this data is so valuable to corporations. And it's this idea of just hyper personalizing everything. Everything is completely personalized to you because they have so much data and there is no common experience. How do is it possible even to have a cohesive common experience anymore? Like, do we have to change the rules of engagement? Do we have to change our idea of what privacy can be and define it as something new that takes this all into account?
No, I think this is has always been there, and it's nothing new. I mean, it has new expressions and it has new manifestations of it, but like this is old news in a way. You know, even just like if you go back to the movie that gave the name to the act of gaslighting, part of what the gaslighter does is they isolate the victim and they bend their reality by partly through isolation. And so I think part of the challenge ahead is to remain strong in our social ties. Democracy depends on citizens trusting each other. And you can't trust complete strangers. And so it's incredibly important to have a very strong network of people. People who are your friends, who are your colleagues, who you trust, and then you trust who they trust. And it's a bit of a chain of citizens that holds things together. And we should remember that life is analog. Everything that matters is analog. Your body, your personal relationships, where you live, what you eat. None of that is digital, and it's never going to be digital, and everything digital depends on the analog. And with regards to this extreme personalization, we're seeing a manifestation of that is really concerning. So Miles Klee at the Rolling Stone has written a series of articles about how chatbots are making people crazy, essentially. They're extremely sycophantic. These large language models like ChatGPT, they tend to tell people that they're brilliant, that they're, right in everything, and that has a tendency to spiral into really bizarre and scary conversations. Sometimes it has ended in tragedy, with people thinking, there was this one guy who thought there was a personality in ChatGPT called Juliet, and that the CEO of OpenAI wanted to kill Juliet, and so he wanted to kill the CEO of OpenAI, and it ended up with an encounter with the police in which he ended up being killed by the police. And I think that's an extreme version of the same thing. It's being isolated. We partly keep our sanity by interacting with others who challenge our views. And it is very annoying to encounter people who think differently. But it's partly that they think differently because they have different experiences, and you are confronted with them. And if you're just talking to a chatbot, it might seem like the same thing. You're just kind of asking the chatbot for its opinion or whatever. But that's not a person. It doesn't have any experience. It doesn't confront you with reality. And so how we keep our check on reality and how we keep democracy together is talking to one another like we're talking to each other now. Democracy is a conversation. And if we leave it to the chatbots, we're just, losing our place at the table of democracy.
We're not in the conversation.
I want to circle back to your suggestions. So you said WhatsApp. Here's the option, Signal. What are some other things that we could make better choices with to protect ourselves and our data?
So instead of using Google search, use DuckDuckGo or Start Page. There are a few options. Instead of using Dropbox, use Proton Drive, use Proton VPN. Instead of using Gmail, use Proton Mail. And, full disclosure, I'm part of the board of the Proton Foundation, but that's because I believe in them. What else? In general, if you want to have a good party, ask your friends not to upload any photos. If you want to have a good conversation with your students, turn off the cameras, turn off the microphones. If you want to have real time with your children, with your family, leave the phone.
In your book, you say buy newspapers, go analog, you choose strong password, don't cyber hoard. As somebody who's just deleted about 25 gigabytes of old stuff off my computer, don't cyber hoard. Change your settings, use privacy extensions, use VPNs, choose privacy. One of the biggest frustrations I have now is cookies that demand. GDPR has created even more friction where a cookie will pop up and you can't just deselect all. You have to I won't go on that page in the end. Sometimes the guardrails, the protection cause more friction and more frustration.
Well, no, that's just a bad law. And it's not bad because people were stupid. It's just at the time, we didn't have enough clout to do better. If the default was no data collection and you had to opt in for data collection, then you would only have to do it once. So it would be a lot less burdensome and a lot more rational. We shouldn't assume that guardrails are going to be a headache. No, not the right kind of guardrails. But yeah, you're right about how frustrating it is. And I think I would find it very depressing if somebody were able to add up the hours I've lost of my life saying no to cookies.
You hit the nail on the head. It needs to be an opt-in versus an opt-out kind of thing, right? But guess what? We don't make the decisions in this case, which is unfortunate.
Since we're on AI and since we're on taking back our decision making and making big decisions to change our habits, when so many people are outsourcing their decision making to AI, what's that eroding?
Well, a lot of things. And, I think we could spend the whole hour just on this question. But perhaps the thing that worries me the most is that we're becoming dependent. And that is the first worry. Because when you get used to something doing things for you and you forget how to do it yourself, then you are a lot less autonomous. And people being less autonomous means that's bad for democracy because we're depending on something. But furthermore, it's not just any company that we're depending on. We're depending on companies that have proven themselves to be notoriously untrustworthy. And thirdly, it's not any kind of product we're depending on. We're depending on a product that is, again, notorious for being unreliable, for being glitchy, for coming up with confabulations and fabricating information. So that makes us a lot more brittle. We're using this in very sensitive contexts like justice and like health and education. So one of the main worries is that we are losing critical thinking skills. one of the funniest, and in a funny, not funny kind of way, story was Chris Stokel writing about how the minister in the UK that deals with digital affairs was using ChatGPT to ask it about policy making with regards to technology. And you're thinking, do I want my policymaker to be asking ChatGPT about how to regulate itself? No.
We have a new series that we've been doing, Carissa, on Thinking on Paper, more of a social thing. We call it a tech walk and talk. There's just a beautiful thing that happens in your brain when you're walking. But one of the things that came up, he asked me about critical thinking. And I think one of the biggest pieces to activate critical thinking is having open-mindedness. How do you land on open-mindedness as an activator of critical thinking?
That's a good question. I don't know. And it depends how we cash out being open-minded. I think that there's a lot of value in trying to understand another person, what it's like to be them, where are they coming from, why are they feeling the way they are, what is their argument that they're making, what are the premises, what's the conclusion. That is incredibly important. But I think sometimes we think of ourselves as being open-minded when we accept uncritically certain kinds of views. And so I think somebody who criticizes tech, for instance, can be accused of not being open-minded enough about how, it's just like you're not used to it. And if you were more open-minded, you would just be enthusiastic about all of these products that these companies are selling us. So I wouldn't want open-mindedness to be confused with lack of good judgment. I think to have good judgment, you also have to be discriminatory in the sense of knowing what is a good argument and what isn't, and what is good evidence and what isn't. And so I think I would be, I'm not sure it's my favorite term because I think it can be confused with other things that are not as constructive.
Are you saying that being open-minded, if you're too open-minded, you're at risk of
too malleable? Yeah, maybe.
Believing something which just shouldn't be on your radar?
Yeah, I think I'm just saying don't be uncritical. Be open-minded, but never at the cost of being uncritical.
So open-mindedness with some structure and some parameters behind it. That makes a lot of sense to me.
I've been thinking about the internet. And if all of the data on the internet, all of the information on the internet, all of the stories on the internet is enough to align AI with these analog values that you've outlined, and let's say it isn't, how do we align AI more with our values?
So the way you phrased the question is really interesting because I think it includes a lot of assumptions that I would like to push back against.
Please do.
So the first assumption is in order to align AI with our values, we need a lot of data. And is all of the data in the internet enough? You said enough, as if, if only we have more data, then it will be enough. And that is, of course, what OpenAI really wants us to believe, partly because they're asking for all the data available and then some. And I think that's the wrong way about it. Ethics is not about the amount of data we have. The second assumption is that this term alignment has been associated, and this is a cultural thing, and it needn't be like this, but of late, it has been associated very closely with tech companies' own vision of how to consider ethics in the context of AI. And of course, tech companies are not the most ethical companies I've encountered. And so here's an unpopular view. Questions of justice and principles and the rule of law are incompatible with machine learning. So machine learning is a statistical analysis of data, and it outputs likely responses, or actually responses that human beings are likely to find attractive. Not true, not ethical, attractive for human beings. And that's not a good way to design ethics. It's just not. So I'll give you an example, because this is sounding a bit abstract, okay? You go to a bank, you ask for a loan. If we use AI, machine learning, then you get a response, yes or no. Why did the algorithm say yes or no? We don't know. Does the data scientist know? No. Does the banker know? No. It analyzed data, your data, it compared it to a lot of other data of people who have paid their loans or not, and then came up with a response. And sometimes when you look into it, it turns out that it was tracking your race, that it was tracking your name, that it was tracking things that it shouldn't track. Now, how do we make an ethical decision based on our values? We put transparent criteria. We say you have to have X amount of dollars in your bank account. And if you don't, then you know how to fix it. But that's not machine learning. And it's not the kind of AI that we're using now. And so how do we align AI with our values? We don't. We either program it program our values. We set a set of transparent criteria that people can know and can appeal. And then we just make it obey it. But we don't use it to come up with those rules. And again, in a rule of law, in a liberal democracy, people need to know what the rules are. Rules need to be public. Laws are public. Right now, we are ruled by rules that we don't know and we don't understand and we can't appeal. And that is the definition of Kafkaesque.
Making things too complicated to understand to where people are just get apathetic about it and just be like, hey, it's the way it is. I don't know all about that stuff. So human values, codifying kind of human values to integrate into these models. What would be 3 of those values be to show a machine what the important things about being human are and what the important things for that machine to recognize about humanity to make it safer for us?
I don't think it works out like that. There aren't 3 things that you can codify easily. But a good start would be human rights, the list of universal human rights. And one of those is privacy. And just with that, I mean, it would mean a huge difference, right? Because at the moment, all of this technology is based on surveillance. And that's kind of mind-blowing. We've become used to it. But if you told someone in the 1950s, we're going to have this system, and it's going to rely on surveillance the way we think it's okay to surveil a criminal, but not anyone else, in the 1950s, people would be shocked for good reason.
What if we flip that narrative on its head, right? We are going to release these devices, and they are going to be data capture points for whoever we want to sell the data to. And we look at these devices as that, like from the perspective of the 50s, if that came out, no one would have them. Everyone would be like, I'm not touching that thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I say big tech is so successful at the narratives, but it's how they package the product. If you package it like one of those electronic devices that people on parole have to use, then it looks a lot less attractive. But it really is quite similar to that. And not only that, it's ranking you all the time. It's, even if we don't have an official social credit score, that is essentially what we're doing, even though it's not as centralized as it would be in a country like China.
I had a sinking sensation in my stomach as you said that, because yes, from the 1950s looking at today, of course, you would say, no, I'm not signing up for that. The problem is that this has been drip fed over 20 years when we've got to a point where we're in it and we can't see from the outside looking in.
I'm going to take us down a hard right here for just a second and just bear with me. There was a project back in the day out of MIT called Open Mustard Seed. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
It was this idea of kind of decentralized.
One day, Jeremy, somebody will have heard of it. One day.
Somebody that built it will come on here and explain why it didn't end up working out. But it's the idea of personal data stores. All of your data goes into one repository that only you control, and you have flows and switches to allow people access to that. You can create multiple, they called them identities, but it never worked out. It wasn't blockchain based. It was database driven.
So Tim Berners-Lee is working on a project called Solid, and that's the idea that people might have pods, he calls it pods, with their data, and that they have control over it and can give access to others, and also, importantly, withdraw that access.
Okay, moving forward, some tangible help. How do you forget in a system that never forgets? Is there any way that I can erase my footprint and get back some of the privacy I gave up?
Yes and no. There is a lot you can do. You can ask companies to delete your data, and it makes a difference. People are too black and white about privacy. They tend to think well, if my data is out there, then there's nothing I can do, and I might as well share more data. And it doesn't work that way. It's a bit like eating sugar. It's like saying, well, I've already eaten one cupcake in my life, so I might as well have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just buckets of sugar. Well, it doesn't work that way, right? The more sugar you have, the more you expose your health to risks. And in the same way, you can delete your data. You can also obfuscate, as I explain in the book. So let's say that your date of birth is out there, and let's say that you've tried to delete it, but you've been unsuccessful. Then you can give other dates of birth, and suddenly it's not as easy to figure out which one is the right one. So there's a lot you can do, and everything you do makes a difference, because you never know which is the data point that might actually risk something important, like your bank account or whatever it might be.
I can't ask you what Socrates can teach us about privacy. Kevin Kelly left a question we ask for all our guests at the end. His question was, what should humanity be, and how does technology help us get there?
I think humanity should be kind. And technology can be a tool in helping us. So every time we use technology to communicate in kind ways, it can help. But fundamentally, it's not what's going to make the difference. And in a way, the technology that I find most incredible and most conducive to becoming a better human being is books. Books are incredible. They allow you to have many lives in one, to learn about what it's like to be a human being in so many different kind of circumstances that you might never find yourself in. It allows you to communicate with people who have lived across the world and thousands of years away from you. And it allows you to communicate with people who are not here yet, to tell them what it's like to be a human being now, what you learned, and what you might have learned that might save them time and pain. And that is part of being kind.
Wow. Beautiful. Beautiful.
It's our favorite technology. So you get all the points for that answer. Thank you.
You're a wonderful human. Just get some rest.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Wow. That was an emotional episode of Thinking on Paper. If you're still with us, and of course you are after that, if you have any questions about that show, email us at hello@thinkingonpaper.xyz, subscribe on the platform you're listening, and please, as a curious mind, share this with just one person in your life who wants, needs, would like to hear these conversations.
Maybe two. Share it with two.
Maybe two. Share it with two.